So all the Avengers are either dead or retired and the world has gone to crap. How's that for an intro? Now, the ending of this video is going to blow your mind, but this is Avengers Twilight, and this opens up with Captain America, or really more just kind of Steve Rogers, right? Just waking up in really kind of his apartment, which is in a lot of ways him just kind of reliving the past, right? Like a Captain America mug and the American flag on the back and all that kind of stuff. In some ways, this story, for those of you guys who saw our video on it, it will feel a lot like Earth X. Right, it'll feel very, very similar to Earth X. But the kicker about all this, right, of course, Captain America's married to Rosie, really just Steve Rogers married to Rosa, but he has one of these things where like in the background, there's kind of like a poster where he was running for senator, but he's older and he's just kind of run down. If you guys ever read House of M, it's very reminiscent to that version of Steve Rogers, right? The one who does not have a super soldier serum. And so as he's kind of like walking through this city, which just kind of looks very technologically advanced and so on and so forth, right? Somebody kind of runs up on him, right? He's like, "Are you Captain America? Like the original Captain America?" And this guy's like, "Yeah," you know, like Steve Rogers is like, "Yeah," you know, and they're like, "I mean, would you mind?" And he doesn't quite let him finish the sentence. And he asks them if they want a selfie, and they say, "No, like, of course not. I would never do something like that." And he's like, "Okay, you know, it's just my memory's not quite what it used to be," and ultimately ends up walking away, only to come across Luke Cage. Now, there is a reason why that encounter between the two of them is so weird and why they avoid the idea of cameras, because there is a big thing that goes on here. This place is much, much darker than it originally appears. Now, Luke Cage himself is just an older and grizzled guy, right? He still has his bulletproof skin to a degree, but we're actually going to learn there's a lot more about him than we are initially introduced to here. The other thing is that as the two of them are making their way through the park, of course, there is a lot of kind of celebrating the idea of superheroes, right? Like people throwing a Captain America frisbee, which is designed, of course, to look like the Shield and things along those lines. But they end up coming across Matt Murdock. Now, one of the things they do talk about is something called H-Day, right? Hero Day, as it's kind of explained here, which seems to be why there's kind of a lot of celebrating and so on and so forth. Again, just because of the art style is a little wonky and we're not really able to make out like the exact details of everything. But one of the cool things that happens is that between Luke Cage, Steve Rogers, and Matt Murdock Daredevil, they're all just older guys. Now, regarding the idea of like cameras and things like that, while it is a kind of offhanded remark, and we will learn more about this later on, Matt Murdock makes reference to something called the Watcher Act, which basically makes it illegal to record. And so every kid out there with a camera phone is kind of being branded as a criminal, right? And Matt Murdock, of course, maintaining his role as a lawyer, is helping to like defend them, right? Things like curfews and so on and so forth. We're not really getting like the inner complexities of it, but we are getting these little tidbits that are dropping to us that are basically kind of pointing out this idea. The country is very, very totalitarian, right? No cameras, curfews, there are always these eyes that are watching them. And in a lot of ways, they kind of talk about their place in this world, right? Now, again, it gets really cool. This is just kind of setting the stage, but they talk about their place in this world. And one of the things that goes on here is Matt Murdock and Luke Cage kind of have a role to play in the sense that Luke Cage is very, very fast and loose about answering the question, like, what do I do? You know, and that kind of a thing. He says that he's really just kind of an ex-mayor, which is actually what was going on and is going on in Marvel Comics at the time. Like right now, Luke Cage is mayor of New York City in Marvel. So of course, this taking place in the future seems to take place in the future of the main Marvel universe. We don't know for sure, right? And honestly, I wouldn't really fixate on that fact too much. But the other thing that Captain America points out here is that he does not have the super soldier serum, and that while Luke Cage and Matt Murdock are saying like somebody needs to be like a symbol of hope, right, and kind of show people that the world can be better than this, the response of really Steve Rogers in a lot of ways is people voted for this, right? Like people don't want change. Like every year or every 4 years or however long, they go to the polls and they vote to keep life this way. But the bigger point that Luke Cage and that Matt Murdock are making here, even if they're only making it kind of under the radar, is, are they really though, right? Like, do people really have a choice of how this world looks? And so here's one of the cool things that I want you to notice here, right? One of the things that I want you guys to kind of pick up. There's how Captain America sees the world, how Steve Rogers sees the world. Then there's how the world really is. And seemingly Luke Cage and Matt Murdock kind of have their ear to the ground and their nose to the ground. They're actually in it day in and day out. Steve Rogers is almost kind of up there in his quote unquote ivory tower. Not in the sense that he's living this life of extravagance, but he's got like a beautiful wife that he's married to, and his life is far more cushy than the average person's. And so in a lot of ways, it paints this picture that Captain America is kind of disconnected from how the world really is. And it's a great analogy, right? It's a great comparison here. It's not to tear down Steve Rogers, but historically speaking, that's kind of always been the case. Captain America, even being a man out of time and being a leader of the Avengers and things like that, was always thrust into a world that he never fully understood. He did his best to understand it and he tried to cope with it, but it wasn't his world. And so on some level, there was always a disconnect between the world as it exists and Steve Rogers in the world, right? Given hero escapades and so on and so forth, it was usually completely irrelevant, right? In this instance, it's totally relevant here because one of the things that we find out is, of course, Steve Rogers had ran for senator and the people had shut him down. The people voted against him. They were like, nope, we do not want you as a senator. We don't want you in any kind of political position. And that's really kind of where he ended up. And so even in a conversation with Rosa, right, his wife, when he's back home, he's kind of talking about the idea that like Luke Cage and Matt Murdock want him to not necessarily go back to being a hero in the traditional sense, but to like stand up for something, right? To like use his name for a greater cause beyond himself. But even Rosa kind of asked the question, so like they want to slap an A on your head and they want to put you in blue tights and send you out there into the world. No. You can do a lot more and have a much greater effect by just using your name and the recognition that comes with it, as opposed to like donning a uniform, right? Because again, heroes are not viewed favorably in the world anymore, at least not the way that they used to be. Again, all this information kind of comes small, but one of the things that happens while they're eating dinner is an advertisement comes on TV for a docuseries called Read Between the Lines. It's this whole docuseries about the Red Skull, that what was actually happening here, and we had to kind of blur out words because YouTube's algorithm demonetizes stuff because YouTube's lazy. But the thing here is that this docuseries paints this picture that the Red Skull was actually trying to bring down the Germans from within. And that guys like Captain America and people like that were actually hindrances in what he was doing. They were problems. They were making life harder. Right? It's painting this picture that the Red Skull was a good guy, and guys like Captain America were more of a nuisance than anything else. It completely and totally blows Steve Rogers' mind because he's like, why in the world would anybody believe that? And when he goes back to his room and he kind of takes out a picture of the old Avengers team, he's just kind of like, nobody cares. Right? Like nobody really cares. And what you get is this kind of flashback moment. And in fact, we're going to get several of these over the course of this video, but you get this flashback moment where the Avengers manage to stop a Hydra bomb plot, right? To just detonate stuff. And it puts on this idea, this air that the Avengers almost kind of seem like Hollywood types. To a degree, not truly, but kind of. Like looking at Captain America, for example, right? Just his haircut, his uniform, all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't go so far as to say he's like a Homelander type character, right? Owned by a corporation, but he certainly looks the part of kind of like putting on the show, right? Like the New Warriors leading up to like Civil War, right? Like that era of comics, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with it. But the bigger point here is what you end up doing is switching over to Stark Industries, and you do not pick up with Tony Stark. Instead, you pick up with a guy by the name of James Stark, who's actually being taken care of by the brother of Jarvis, right? So a lot of the characters that we know are kind of out of here. More so than that, we end up learning that James is actually the son of Tony Stark and Janet Van Dyne. But unlike his father, Tony Stark, who was kind of a billionaire playboy, but usually trying to do the right thing, James is far more corrupt than Tony Stark was. More so than that, we end up finding out that apparently there's some kind of a border skirmish between Latveria and Hungary. And so the president of the United States requests that James starts building more Iron Man suits or developing more Iron Man armor that can be given to soldiers to use in the fight overseas to kind of quell this skirmish. That is something that I do want you to keep in the back of your head. But one of the things that happens here is that James is told by his butler, the FBI have informed me that we may need to talk down an old friend. So the FBI is more like a spy agency, right? Like spying on its own citizenry. And so what you do is you pick up with a kind of news report or a kind of interview between James and Captain America, where as these guys are talking, really Steve Rogers, we should just start calling him that, where as these guys are talking, that James kind of brings out the idea, are heroes really even heroes? You say that you're heroes, right? You say that you guys were heroes, but H-Day taught us that there are no heroes. Now, this is where we get a kind of explanation, but I would imagine that as this goes on, we'll get a more in-depth explanation of what H-Day is. But the bigger thing here is that H-Day was apparently an event where the villains seized control of the Incredible Hulk. So it's not that dissimilar from like Old Man Logan, right, or Acts of Vengeance, right, from the 1980s. But whatever the case is, the Incredible Hulk, under the control of the villains, just started laying waste to huge levels of the city. And in fact, a lot of innocent people died. And what ends up happening is there's this comment that's made by Captain America. And in fact, James even says it was the day the world woke up and realized there is no line between vigilante quote unquote heroes and media dubbed villains. Unparalleled destruction by all, but the death count fell mostly to Dr. Bruce Banner. The Hulk was a founding member of the Avengers, was he not, Steve? And the response to Steve Rogers? I've said it before, it was Ultron. He enhanced the villains, took control of Bruce Banner. The response of James? Yes, Ultron, right? Like the evil AI created by yet another Avenger, Dr. Hank Pym. How are we supposed to believe you about the Red Skull when you don't even know what a hero looks like? And so it's one of those things where it just calls everything Captain America knows into question. Now, here's one of the big differences here, right? And here's something that I hope you notice, right? When it comes to the news as it's portrayed here, there's what the public perceives the news to be. Then there's what the news actually is. The public perceives the news as informative, this organization that exists out there for the purpose of making sure the general public is always aware of what's happening. But the way in which the news actually works in Avengers Twilight is that it's propaganda, right? Like they rely on the public's perception of them, all the while spoon feeding them lies and then duping the public into believing that what they're telling them is the truth. And it's just a great big huge kind of circular organization, right, that just runs everything, that even James Stark himself is aware of. Captain America doesn't really seem to understand how deep reaching it is. In the here and now, he's just pissed off because James called him into question and is like, are you really going to tarnish the legacies of your own parents, that kind of thing? It gets under his skin, right? Because by and large, it's just James, a guy who was never alive or seemingly never alive during the era of heroes, never fought alongside the heroes, questioning a guy who was there, right? It's very much like a few good men type thing, right? Like, I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the very blanket of freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. It's that kind of situation here, right? Like James is calling into question everything Steve Rogers fought for, having no real firsthand account of what it actually meant to be there. And so it's really, really interesting, right? A guy who's read about what happened versus a guy who lived what happened, right? Experience would almost always be the victor there. The thing to understand though is that reading back on it historically gives you a much greater context than the person who lived through it. They lived through one part of it. Reading about it allows you to experience the whole thing. So which one of these comes out on top if one of those things exists at all? Because that's one of the points that James makes, right? Like you as heroes painted the world as black and white. There's good guys, there's bad guys, and the good guys fight the bad guys, and the good guys beat the bad guys. Roll credits, right? It doesn't work that way, right? Like if anything was taught to the world by H-Day, it's that it's never that simple. There's always collateral damage. Who thinks about the people who die in the collapsing buildings when the heroes and the villains fight? You don't, because if you did, you wouldn't be fighting them in highly populated areas, right? It's all these kind of back and forth, and they both have credible points, calling in the very nature of all these superheroes. But even when Captain America flashes back to H-Day, he kind of looks around and he just sees all these dead bodies, heroes, villains alike. And as he's having this kind of flashback and experiencing this, really you could call it PTSD, that we get this moment where we pick up with one of the events that had happened, and that it's really just kind of Black Widow asking the question, are there any updates? The response of Iron Man is, nothing yet, Natasha, just that it looks like all secret identities have been blown wide open. Everyone's being lured to their loved ones and ambushed. Groups of supervillains all enhanced. The question of Captain America, who's doing the enhancements? The response of Iron Man, I don't know yet, Cap. would need to actually capture one of these guys to study them. And so once the heroes get to where they're supposed to be landing at, right, New York, Spider-Man is one of the people who are dead, right? Spider-Man, or at least he's dying anyway, right? He talks about how like he had saved the life of his Aunt May. He reveals his identity to Captain America, or at least partially reveals it. And it says like, my name's Peter. He doesn't quite get the whole word out. The response of Captain America is, you're Spider-Man, son, right? Like you're the best of us. And so he has this kind of flashback. It's really cool because it's like, I really want to see what happened, how everything unfolded. I'm really hoping Chip Zdarsky just kind of gives us like this one comic where it just explains everything just in just gritty detail. But in the midst of this flashback, Captain America's met by cops, right? Steve Rogers is met by the cops who show up on the scene. And they basically tell him, hey man, curfew's coming, you need to get out of here. But as he's leaving, he comes across these kids who are being recorded while they're like skateboarding and performing tricks and stuff like that. The cops are just like, so what do we have here, right? Like illegal recording out past curfew. And so it's just like, no man. And where the kids are just like, curfew's not for another 10 minutes. This cop's just like, not according to my watch, right? Like corruption is basically what it is, right? Corrupt cops abusing their powers. One of the kids calls him a fascist, and Steve Rogers decides to stand up to these cops. Now, the cool thing about this is even having no super soldier serum, he is able to humble these guys quite readily, right? Because what he realizes is he says, these guys are bozos, right? Like most people out there who couldn't get respect if they paid for it, these guys put on suits, and it gives them some measure of authority, some measure of control, right? A feeling of strength that can help embolden a coward. But he's like, at the end of the day, they are the exact same kind of people that I've always fought, right? Like I fought people like this time and time again. So literally he's just like, they crumple like paper. That's really all they are. And he manages to take out most of these guys. But of course, one of them ends up getting him over the head with a billy club. And then the rest of them start attacking him, only for him to be rescued by these guys who just come out of nowhere and just pummel these cops, right? Just absolutely tear these cops apart and potentially even kill them. We're not really sure if they do or not, but then ultimately they black bag Steve Rogers, right? Just throw a sack over his head and whisk him away. Now, one dark thing that does happen here, this is something that I do want to point out. There comes this moment where James, following the orders of the president, goes to the raft in order to find quote unquote inspiration, right? To figure out how to build these new suits. When he gets there, what we end up finding out is that he's got his father in a tank, and that he's basically seeming to use his father's intelligence in order to build this stuff. We don't know exactly how he makes it work, but he has his father alive, right? Like Tony Stark is being kept alive and being used by his son for information. It's pretty screwed up, right? It's pretty dark. But when Captain America comes to, right, switching back to Steve Rogers, when he comes to, he wakes up in what seems like an underground facility, only to be met by Luke Cage. Because what Luke Cage is actually doing, where he was very cloak and dagger about his actions and about his efforts, where Matt Murdock was doing the same thing because they always knew they were being watched, that he's actually the leader of an underground resistance, or not really a leader, more of like an advisor for an underground resistance force. Now, one of the things that we also learn here is that while Luke Cage did historically have bulletproof skin, as he aged, his skin actually started to harden to the point where he couldn't move of his own accord. He needed assistance to be able to move around. But in effect, he tells Steve Rogers, Matt Murdock's dead, right? Like they took him out. He's like, the world that you think you know, which is cops abusing teenagers because they're staying out too late past curfew, and the media putting out some propaganda, that's not the world as it exists. Right? That's the world as you've seen it. That the reality here, Steve, is you are removed. You don't really see how bad it is out there, right? He's like, on the surface, it looks fine, but there's rot. We're not getting any of the picture anymore. It's a jigsaw puzzle with just the edges. He says the government and S.H.I.E.L.D. are squashing political dissent. The new Avengers are laying waste to countries overseas. And the response to Steve is, no, there's no way that's true. If it was, I would know. And the response of Luke is, how? The news? The internet? It's all under control of a conglomerate, a group that Jan and Tony's kid is a part of. And he says, we're trying to get the word out. We've been broadcasting to find others, to spread the truth, but it's not enough. We need someone for people to rally around, and there's only one person for a job like that. And the response of Steve is like, I can't do that, Luke, right? Like I couldn't even protect some skateboarding kids because the super soldier serum was taken away from Steve Rogers. He's just an old guy, right? And so Luke says you could with this. And what he does is he reveals that they've recreated the machine that turned him into Captain America, right? This girl named Carrie was the person who was able to pull it off, right? The super soldier serum. And Carrie even goes so far as to say, like, we've been doing our best and we've been trying to replicate you on different versions of us. But Steve is just like, they keep dying because it only works on some and there's no definitive way to know. And that's true, right? Steve Rogers was just luck of the draw, right? If you go back and you read Ed Brubaker's Captain America run, one of the things that he points out is like, there's no way to have known that Steve Rogers was going to survive. It was hoped by Abraham Erskine that it would, but he could have just easily died like anybody else, right? It's not like his hope and his courage was so great that it overrode the function of the super soldier serum and it bent it to his whim, right? It's not like that, right? It doesn't really work that way, right? He could have easily been killed, but it does work on him. And so their whole thing is, you should take the super soldier serum, right? Like when he tells Luke Cage, like, you can't be serious, he's like, I am, right? I'm as serious as a heart attack, Steve. I don't expect you to be part of our group of defenders here working from the shadows. You're Captain America. You're an Avenger, right? And that's where he's just kind of like defenders, right? Like, this is your group. And the response of Luke is, no, it's not my group, right? I'm too old. I can't really move the way that I used to, right? Ever since my bulletproof skin decided to become nearly immovable, I'm all about knowledge. But given all the experience that Luke Cage has had over his time as an Avenger, he can impart words of wisdom on a lot of these younger folks. He can organize them. He can corral them towards a singular cause. He can teach them how to fight in such a way to where they can take pot shots, guerrilla warfare tactics, essentially, right? Because unlike Captain America, who was the Avenger that was like off in space fighting the Builders or like facing off against, you know, Galactus or something, you know, who knows, the great grandiose type of events. Luke Cage was always a street level Avenger. Even when he led the mighty Avengers with like White Tiger and Blue Marvel, Adam Brashear, and those guys, it was still very much a ground level team. And so this ability to impart that kind of ground level knowledge on how to hit here, hit there, to dodge, bob and weave, never get hit, it's invaluable information. And so what Luke Cage says is that Amy, right, this girl here, she's the one that runs everything. I may have said Carrie before, I meant to say Amy, but he's like, Amy's the one who runs everything, right? She formerly worked for S.H.I.E.L.D. She turncoated, right? And so Amy says, Matt Murdock died defending people who the system was trying to disappear. We've been working nonstop trying to gain intel on all of this. People on the inside have managed to get up photos, old school, of like all the different abuses, that kind of thing. And she says, these are Americans. This is what we're up against. It is an American government, corrupt, abusing the American people. What Americans need is to, one, be shown the truth of what's actually happening so they stop believing the lies of the news. And then two, they need someone to rally around. It's not to say that the American people are cowards. I mean, on some level, sure, in comparison to superheroes, but the American people have a lot to lose if they were to stand up to their government, including their own lives. What they need is a force that will inspire a level of hope that will overcome that fear, and that people will say, yes, I may lose something in response to what it is that I'm doing, but the reality here is what I'm getting is infinitely better. And without that hope, they will never take the first step. And so Steve Rogers, in realizing this, leaves a message for his wife. He says, Rosa, it's me. I'm sorry, this is a message and not in person. I just need you to know I'm okay. I'm more than okay, really. I won't be home for a while because there's something I need to do. I'm opening my eyes and hopefully the eyes of others, but I cannot do it alone. And he says, Rosa, I'm going to assemble the Avengers, because Steve Rogers enters the machine. He's blasted with Vita Rays. He gets the super soldier serum back and he goes back to being Captain America. And I gotta be honest, guys, never have I cared so much about this guy. I am so excited to see where this story goes. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Again, this is coming out monthly, I believe. So I think we'll be back next month with part 2 of this, and I will catch you all later. Peace.